Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Mike Green of the United States Studies Center in Sydney and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green, and I'm here for our 125th episode with someone who's going to put it all in perspective for us, Toshi Yoshihara. Toshi is Senior Fellow at CSBA, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments in Washington, a think tank well known for its detailed and precise breakdown, not only of budgets, but of military strategy, doctrine, and operations. Toshi came to CSBA from the U.S. Naval War College, where he was the inaugural John A. Van Buren Chair of Asia-Pacific Studies and a professor of strategy. Toshi, been looking forward to this. Thanks for joining us.
Mike, thanks for having me, and congratulations on the 125th episode.
Yeah, eventually we'll get one right. This will be the one. Well, first question, who was John Van Buren, the name holder of the chair you had at the War College? Is that an admiral we should know about?
John Van Buren is a local benefactor in the Newport, Rhode Island area. I think he was an executive at Standard Oil back in the day.
Okay.
And he's been a real strong supporter of the Naval War College. He basically funded the Van Buren Chair, and I happen to be the inaugural chair, for that position.
And the focus is on Asia Pacific. And
that's right.
The Naval War College has a storied history thinking through conflict in the Pacific, even though it's on the east coast of the United States, with those very famous War Plan Orange games up in the top floor, I guess, of the main building. I forgot the name of the main hall. And you've probably seen those old black and white photos from the 20s and earlier of admirals and professors with wooden mock-ups of fleets and basically spread out all over the floor and pushing them around with long poles and trying to defeat Japan in a notional series of exercises from the other side of the Pacific. Big challenge, which is a lead-in to what we're going to talk about today, the first island chain, the second island chain, deterrence in the Western Pacific. Naval War College is a great place, and so is CSBA. But how did you get there? Did you play with toy ships as a kid? Was your mom or dad Navy? What's the origin story for Professor Toshi Yoshihara in naval strategy?
Yeah, so my origin story basically starts in the early 1990s when I was an undergrad at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service.
Hoya Saxa?
Yeah, Hoya Saxa, absolutely. And I had the pleasure of working with a great professor and a mentor who ended up becoming my senior thesis advisor. And I'm sure you know him, Chongpin Lin. He, of course, later would become the Vice Minister of Defense for Taiwan. And then I ended up working for him at the American Enterprise Institute as a research assistant. And of course, as you know, it was a very interesting time to study China at AEI at the time, because the director of the Asia Studies program was none other than Ambassador James Lilly, who was a legendary figure in China studies. And so it was through Chongpin's mentorship and my time working at the AEI that got me really started in China's military modernization. And I think if you look back to that period in the early to mid 1990s, that actually was a period in which the study of the PLA was kind of a niche area, because the PLA was frankly kind of a non-issue, I think, inside of Washington. And as you might recall, the familiar refrain back in the day about China's coercive option against Taiwan was this a million-man swim, right? So a very sort of condescending attitude about China's military capabilities. And so, when I look back to the period when I got my sort of first start in studying the Chinese military, it just goes to show how far the Chinese had come within basically a generation. But back to my story. So after I graduated Georgetown, I decided to try out law school. And so I decided to work at a law firm to see what it was like, and I ended up hating it. The part of the profession that was most interesting had a very poor quality of life. You basically didn't have a life. And the areas of the practice that promised a decent quality of life was also deadly boring. And so I decided really at the very last minute to not take the LSATs and instead take the GREs to go into grad school for IR to study international relations. And so in many ways, learning what I hated helped to reinforce and to understand, what I truly loved. And so from that, I continued to do strategic studies, went to a PhD program at the Fletcher School, again, just maintaining my focus on China's military. And then through a series of twists and turns, ended up getting a job at the Air War College. And that was how I got my start in professional military education. Eventually made my move to the Naval War College, where I taught strategy for about a decade before coming to CSBA. So I think the thing that I like to tell the younger folks who want some career advice, I always tell them from my own experience is that it's okay to try to figure things out along the way. It's okay not to know, what you want to do. It's okay not to get locked into a particular career track. And it's totally okay to change your mind.
And you probably need to try a couple things to make sure you don't want to do them. I also had when I was undergrad, a summer internship as an assistant paralegal in a law firm. And that also pushed me towards the direction of being a poorly paid strategist rather than a highly paid tactician. So Jim Lilly, if listeners to this podcast don't know who Jim Lilly is, he was one of the giants in the field. He, former CIA, served in Japan, was the representative in Taiwan, worked in the Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush administrations in the NSC. And then for Bush, he was ambassador in Beijing. He was ambassador in Korea. Just a tough but lovable Cold Warrior. And AEI was an exciting time. And I remember I was a PhD student when you were there as an RA. And I remember going to AEI things. And I finished my PhD, started working for Joe Nye and Kurt Campbell. And there were big debates about whether we even needed to worry about China at all. I remember, the PLA Navy was smaller, considerably smaller than the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces. PLA Air Force was dragging fighter jets, I think J-8s, out on the tarmac with oxen. What an incredible exponential explosion in military capability and military reach, which is a good lead into our discussion today. We're going to talk a lot about geography, which when you were at Georgetown, did you have to take Map of the Modern World? Did they have that then?
Absolutely. That made such an impression on me. We all had to take it as students of the School of Foreign Service. It was a requirement, and the entire class had to take it. And we had to take that test where you had to know every country in the world. You had to know every capital, every detail. It was quite the crucible, if you will, as a part of that undergraduate experience.
So many international relations programs are trapped in this postmodernist spiral where they don't talk about places and institutions and geography, and you have to be grounded. And when I was in Georgetown teaching, I'm still a professor on leave, but when I was teaching, they were always looking for professors to volunteer to go do a practice competition with the students. And nobody wanted to do it because every year the students would win because they really got into it. So geography, first island chain, that's the chain, of course, that stretches from the Kuriles down through Japan, Taiwan, Philippines. Second island chain is down towards Guam. When I wrote a history of U.S. strategy, starting in 1783, naval strategists were talking about the first island chain as early as the War of 1812, because we actually had a ship in the Pacific. And it features prominently in the early Cold War NSC documents. You see it in there in the declassified documents. And then we just sort of forgot about it. And then somewhere around the Obama administration, 2010s, people started paying attention again. And now I think most people know what the first island chain is. I'm told that in an NSC meeting about China's coercion against the first island chain, most of the principals around the table in the Situation Room did not know what it was.
Wow.
Now I think most people now do. But why don't you just give us what's the first island chain, second island chain? Why does it matter in terms of geopolitics and deterrence?
Yeah, if I could maybe rewind the clock back to, say, the end of World War II, just to set the historical precedent. I know that you've also written about it in your book. This whole idea of the first island chain, in part, started with an important post-war lesson after the Pacific War, which was a lesson of never again. Never let a local power achieve dominance over a key region or a key piece of terrain where that hegemon would be able to acquire the resources and the capabilities to project power to threaten the United States in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, we were thinking at the time, at the end of the Pacific War, about how an isolationist United States essentially allowed the danger to gather in Europe and Asia that eventually led to a global war. And so one of the lessons is that to prevent that from ever happening again, we needed to maintain a favorable balance of power in Europe and in Asia. And that, in part, required an engaged forward posture, but not just militarily, but it was designed to really enmesh those in Europe and Asia in tight economic, political, diplomatic, cultural, and multilateral ties to form a bulwark against the rising threat at the time, which was, of course, the Soviet Union and later Communist China. And I think what's really important to note here is that this logic of maintaining a favorable balance of power to prevent the rise of a local hegemon has persisted not only through the Cold War, but in the post-Cold War period. So if you read the policy documents from the early 90s all the way through today, whether it's the Quadrennial Defense Review or the regional strategies or the National Defense Strategy, there's this language about maintaining a favorable balance of power. So there's a very strong, what you might call a bipartisan consensus about this imperative. And so kind of going back to the origins of the first island chain, the question for policymakers then in the late 40s was, where and how do you maintain that favorable balance of power in Asia? And I think if you think back to the statements and the various correspondences between statesmen and military commanders at the time from, George Kennan, General Douglas MacArthur, Dean Acheson, John Foster Dulles, all of them helped to codify this offshore strategic posture, which was to maintain a forward military presence along this island chain to contain the Soviet communist threat and later the Red Chinese threat. And so in late 1949, for example, MacArthur spoke about this Anglo-Saxon lake where there would be a line of defense that would run through. I think he does call it a chain of islands that's right off the Asian coast, and that this chain would start from the Philippines. It would run through the Ryukyus with Okinawa at its sort of central hub, running through Japan, through the Aleutians all the way to Alaska. And the goal was to have key bases along this first island chain in order to radiate military power along their eastern seaboard of Eurasia. And that's really kind of the beginning of this forward posture along the first island chain. And we continue to live with that legacy.
Some scholars call it offshore balancing. I don't think that's quite right, because that implies a kind of a British approach to the Low Countries. And what you're talking about is a much more extensive network of alliances and bases. And so in the Reagan administration, they called it not offshore balancing, but a picket fence to contain Soviet expansion. And we used the geography, the Reagan administration did, to turn the tables on the Soviets and to utilize Japan's ability to close key straits and do air and anti-submarine warfare out to 1,000 nautical miles to basically bottle up the Soviets and link that to the Central Front at the time, which was Europe, and allow horizontal escalation. So the island chain was an advantage for Team USA. And when Nakasone Japan came on board, it was great. Is that still true? Because the PLA is now operating beyond the first island chain to the second island chain. They're operating, they're doing regular exercises around Guam. Is it possible the first island chain is now in the wrong place? It's too far inside the envelope of Chinese military power?
I think the first island chain is still a very important construct because, as you noted, it is essentially the network of allies that we have in the region. We have formal treaty allies on the first island chain. We also have a former ally, Taiwan, which is still a very close security partner. The first island chain is home to some of our most important, military bastions. So if you think about Yokosuka Naval Base, where we have a permanently forward deployed carrier, the only one in the world where we have that kind of an arrangement. We have, Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, which is a major hub of American air power. And so the way I think about the first island chain is what my former collaborator and longtime friend, Jim Holmes, and I have described as a Great Wall in reverse, which is that it's not China's Great Wall, it's our Great Wall, where we have these sentinels sort of lined up from a north to south axis. And I think it's this foundation that we're able to thus far maintain a favorable balance of power. And I think, if you think about the allies who are occupants of the first island chain, they are critical themselves in maintaining that favorable balance of power. They're key trading partners, major economies in their own rights. They share our values as democracies. They're also maritime nations that truly understand what it means to have free access and use of the seas. And it's not surprising that the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific came from Japan, right? A kind of a classic maritime nation. And so I think this construct still remains an essential component, even as China tries to probe and tries to maintain its presence felt sort of east of the first island chain.
And when you think about the economies in the first island chain, Japan, third largest economy in the world, Taiwan, semiconductor manufacturing powerhouse, down to Australia, Korea, something like half of container shipping in the world goes along that island chain. So it's more than just a sort of Great Wall. It's an actual, Kennan talked about Japan and Germany as the center of geopolitics because of their industrial base. And it really is also not just a wall, it's not just a picket fence, not just offshore balancing. It is the heartbeat, the economies of the free world, basically. So you can't abandon it. I wrote in my book a vignette about the 1930s when the State Department hired a former diplomat to write a strategy because War Plan Orange wasn't working. They didn't know how they were going to defend the Philippines as the Imperial Japanese Navy got so big. And his recommendation was don't. Get out, cut and run, quietly retreat, get out of the first, second island chain, go back to Hawaii, and don't even defend that. And we don't have the record of what happened, but obviously that's not what happened. It was just unthinkable then. And of course now, incredibly important to U.S. and global economic and geopolitical futures, not just the geography. I was struck, I'm sure you were too, that in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, the first island chain makes an appearance. Actually, it's in many respects, it's almost the entirety of the strategic concept for the Asia Pacific, and is described as denying any aggression anywhere on the first island chain is critical to preventing large-scale military conflict. A lot of the NSS and NDS struck me as a kind of Rorschach test, like a temporary psychological portrayal of what was going on inside the Trump administration's ideological brain. But this one has staying power. This is a real strategic concept. But what do you think when you saw it in there? Is this, it's a point of continuity, I suppose, over 200 years. But what was your take on the first island chain concept in the NSS and NDS?
Yeah, I had a similar reaction like you, particularly in the national security strategy, where it really went into great detail about not only the importance of the first island chain, but the geostrategic importance of Taiwan. That, it was the center of critical microelectronic production. It was also sort of at the midpoint of the first island chain. It, created a buffer between the first and second island chain from the perspective of the United States. It was at the kind of the epicenter of the maritime thoroughfare of the sea lanes passing north to south along the East Asian seaboard. And so I was, frankly, given the fact that I've studied this for so long, I was gladdened to kind of read about this very hard-headed geostrategic approach to the first island chain concept.
We, the U.S. and U.S. allies, are definitely picking up our game to realize that strategy and to deter conflict in the first island chain. And it go into more detail if you like, but it, of course, includes new command headquarters for Japan, the Japan Joint Operational Command, a planned new upgrade of the U.S. command in Japan to Joint Task Force Capable Warfighting Command in Japan, which has not been the case, to actually run the fight in the first island chain from the first island chain, or at least in part. Force posture initiatives with Australia, enhanced EDCA, enhanced defense cooperation agreement with the Philippines to get more access, a lot more mobility for the Marine Corps in particular to be able to pop onto islands, smaller islands with surface-to-surface missiles. But there's also a lot of stuff we're not doing, hardening. We saw in Iran that the Iranians were using drones to target U.S. naval bases and air bases that weren't hardened. So I'd be interested in your take on how we're doing, we, the U.S. and allies, in actually having a strategy for deterring in the first island chain that will work. Because, of course, the other side gets a vote. And we see the PLA, which we'll get to in a minute, doing even bigger things than they ever have.
Yeah, if you don't mind, maybe me going through this idea of a denial defense along the first island chain, and then talk a little bit about the China challenge in the context of denial defense, and then all of the things that we need to do, which is frankly a pretty long list. So A denial defense is basically a concept that's designed to prevent the adversary from achieving its operational objectives. And one of the key illustrative cases is to prevent a Chinese fait accompli over Taiwan. And a fait accompli basically means that China's goals would be to seize Taiwan as quickly as possible with an amphibious assault, ideally before the United States has the time to, mobilize fully and to respond. And Chinese forces would then dig in and then make the conquest of Taiwan, assuming that the invasion was successful, to make it as irreversible as possible and thereby present the world with a done deal. And so a denial defense really is designed to prevent the Chinese seizure of the island in the first place, to prevent the fait accompli. And to do this, we need all sorts of capabilities that are designed, for example, to destroy the amphibious fleet that would be needed to cross the strait to take the island. More expansively, we probably need to have capabilities to destroy the forces that are assembling along the Chinese coast at Chinese ports, before they even sortie out across the strait. And then we would probably need the kinds of forces to destroy PLA forces that have already landed and made it ashore, but to make sure that they can't break out of their lodgements, to break out of the beachheads to take the major cities on the island. And the threat that we face, if we were to try to intervene on behalf of Taiwan, is this idea of a reconnaissance strike complex, which is basically a marriage of modern sophisticated sensors with long-range precision strike systems. And that's, of course, the large family of ballistic and cruise missiles that China could launch from land, from the sea, from the undersea, and from the air. And this complex is designed to sort of go after our way of warfare that we've developed over the past few decades, and that way of warfare has specific vulnerabilities. So we have a few big bases that are, that have concentrations of high value assets and equipment and logistical facilities on the first island chain. We need a lot of time to surge forces across the Pacific and then to assemble them for the offensive along the first island chain. We rely on vulnerable, high-value assets like the carrier to conduct some of these operations. We rely on a long and brittle logistical chain that stretch across the Pacific. And we also rely on a fragile information system for command and control of forces. And so this reconnaissance strike complex that China has developed is designed to knock out our bases on the island chain, disrupt the flow of forces toward the island chain, to go after our capital ships and air power that's operating along the island chain, and to blind and deafen us through non-kinetic attacks like cyber offensives. And so the goal from the Chinese perspective is to impose really heavy cost if we decided to intervene. And ideally, the prospect of those costs may be so high that we might decide not to intervene in the first place, which is this whole idea of winning without fighting. And I think there are also other, you might call them enduring structural problems for the United States that China could take advantage of. And so the first thing is that we're a global power with global interests. So we're spread pretty thin. Only a proportion of our forces are available at any given time in the Western Pacific. And we are going through what's been called the terrible 20s, where our military forces through the 2020s and into the early 2030s will be their oldest and their smallest in recent decades. So we're dipping into this, what's been called a capability or capacity trough, or a bathtub, whatever metaphor we choose to use. And the question for us is sort of how deep and how long that trough is going to be. And then finally, I think the other issue with denial defense is this risk of a Pyrrhic victory, meaning in trying to defend the first island chain, we end up breaking our phalanx in the process. And so, we've seen various war games in the past where we could technically win a war over Taiwan, but we could end up losing the peace because we just lost all of those capabilities that would be needed to uphold the order once the war is over. And so those are the kinds of problems that China's military buildup, in particular, the reconnaissance strike complex, pose to our forces and to our allied forces. And so we've known sort of the operational problem set for years, if not decades, right? And I think there's quite a bit of differing opinions, if you will, about how well we're doing. I think there are basically two sets of things that our military would need to do to deal with this reconnaissance strike complex. So the first is, resilience against PLA firepower. And so, as you've already mentioned, missile and air defenses are going to be critical in this kind of conflict because we would need to thin out the incoming fire. And we are seeing in real time in Iran just how quickly we can expend and run through the stockpiles of those interceptors. And as you mentioned, we need to harden our bases. And the goal there is to make sure that China can't deliver one swift blow and, knock out our bases. And there's, I think, some degree of criticism that we haven't done nearly enough to harden our infrastructure along the first island chain. We also know that we need to engage in base dispersal, meaning that we need to build additional bases elsewhere, either along the first island chain or even along the second island chain, to allow some of our high-value assets to divert to those air bases and facilities. Also to complicate PLA targeting, because we want to create as many targets as possible so that the PLA can't simply, deliver this one big blow against the concentration of bases that we have. And then we need to have, in addition to having sort of that defensive resilience, is we need to have offensive capabilities, obviously, to destroy that amphibious fleet, for example. And people have called on the military to, double down on submarines because it's, our comparative advantage thus far, at least. We need, long-range bombers that can carry a lot of anti-ship cruise missiles. We need to deploy our own, A2AD, our own anti-access area denial capabilities like land-based maritime strike systems. And then we just need to have a lot of everything. We need to have a lot of longer-range firepower. We need to have a lot more platforms, a lot more ships and aircraft to deliver that firepower. That's really a kind of a daunting, long list of things that, in my view, we haven't done enough of to deal with China's rapid modernization.
Did you see our friend Zach Cooper's piece in Foreign Affairs on this, which was pretty pessimistic and said we need to scale back our objectives?
I did.
Are you that pessimistic or a little more in the Admiral Paparo range, which is, yes, it's hard, but we've got this? Admiral Paparo, the Indo-Pacific Command.
Yes. I mean, I do think that time is clearly running out, but I still think that we have some time left to reinforce the front. And, and the problem with the first island chain, and, perhaps this is something I should have mentioned earlier, is that what makes the first island chain so important is that there really isn't anything left east of the first island chain, right? So like if you compare the strategic geography of maritime Asia to Europe, continental Europe has a lot of strategic depth, right? So it runs from Poland, arguably all the way out to the UK. With the first island chain, you fall back east of Japan and that's it. It's thousands of kilometers of ocean. And so in some ways that limits the kinds of choices that we have in terms of the kinds of strategic terrain that we need to defend. And so we do need to think more creatively. Admiral Paparo, of course, and others have talked about, using unmanned systems, a lot of attritable mass essentially to create this so-called hellscape around the Taiwan Strait to significantly complicate PLA operations when they're trying to cross the strait. That would then buy us time to surge those reinforcements across the Pacific. So I'm not quite there yet in terms of abandoning this key goal of defending the first island chain. Yeah,
I'm not as pessimistic as Zach, who's a very smart guy, but I think there are a couple things on the positive side of the ledger worth flagging. First of all, Beijing's objective could be described as regime change in Taipei. If there's a conflict, that's what they're after. And as Putin's finding in Ukraine and we and the Israelis are finding in Iran, regime change is extremely hard. And if there's any kind of hellscape in the way, what Admiral Paparo describes, as you point out, is the mix of capabilities that would be thrown at the PLA if they tried to invade or take Taiwan, pretty daunting, actually. I also think we have more opportunity than we've ever had. And look, the Trump administration is squandering this in many ways, but we have more opportunity than we've ever had to move towards actual coalition capabilities in the Western Pacific. As you know, our treaty system since 1951 has been bilateral treaties with Japan, with Australia, New Zealand out, kind of in, kind of out, and then Korea, Taiwan out, in, then out, and now quasi in. But the Philippines as well. And I don't think in my career I've ever seen anywhere near this level of consensus politically up and down the first island chain that we need some kind of coalition capabilities. Now, the consensus is stronger in the uniform military because they're looking at the problem, but you can see that in Japan, it's debate's over. Recognizing collective self-defense. Philippines, volatile politically, but clearly the debate has moved towards plugging into a coalition capability of some kind. Australia's, if you look at the Australian military exercises like Talisman Sabre, Force Posture. So none of the governments have signed on for a joint task force coalition capability that's formalized. And some of the governments are more skeptical than others. But if you look at how militaries are exercising, building equipment, it's not enough, arguably, but it's more than we've ever seen. And the thing about it is, the more China pushes, the more it's going to happen. So that's a little bit of the slightly more optimistic side of why this is very, very complicated for China. But push back if you want. I tend to be an optimist, which is not a good thing for a think tank academic guy in the space. We're meant to be pessimistic and afraid, but I can't help it. I have a sunny disposition. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think, one of the key driving factors behind all of this is China itself, right? China is in many ways a cooperative adversary to the extent that the actions that it's taking, particularly its peacetime coercive actions, have really raised awareness of the China challenge down the first island chain, whether it's their probing against, South Korea in the Yellow Sea, or whether it's the coercive actions against the Japanese around the Senkakus, or the increasingly regular maritime and aerial exercises in the Sea of Japan and now in the Northwest Pacific on Japan's eastern-facing part of the first island chain, and of course, obviously the very intense peacetime exercises around Taiwan, and of course the coercive actions against the Philippines, and on and on and on. And so I think that has really helped to galvanize and to accelerate really a kind of a counterbalancing coalition amongst the various partners along the first island chain. And I would also say that I think, one of the trends that we're seeing also is that the occupants of the first island chain are increasingly collaborating with each other, whether it's closer Japanese security cooperation with Australia, capacity building efforts with the Philippines, and so forth. And so I think hopefully what we'll see is this maybe more of an informal coalitional effort to bind the first island chain into a more coherent whole.
That's a big part of what we're doing in Sydney here at the U.S. Studies Center. It's a think tank set up to teach about the U.S. We have American Studies program, but on the think tank side, a lot of it is thinking about the alliance and the future of the alliance. And it's a pickup game. It's a coalition thing. It's not a bilateral thing. So we do a lot of trilateral, quadrilateral meetings, and a lot with India and Europe, not necessarily clearly not in the first island chain, or even likely, I suppose, to contribute forces, but able to impose a strategic cost. And so that also is part of this. We, the United States, is not doing a good job. The Trump administration's alienating Europe on again, off again with India. But the opportunity is there. Say something, if you could, about the PLA exercises. They've gone up in terms of capabilities in North Asia, but now, pretty much the last year or so, we've really seen them go out laterally in terms of geography. And you had nearly sequential, nearly simultaneous exercises by the PLA, particularly the PLA Navy, around Australia and New Zealand, between Guam and Hawaii, Yellow Sea, first island chain. It looks, to overuse a historical parallel, it looks like Yamamoto's strategy in 1941 and 42, and particularly cutting off the Americans from being able to reinforce from Australia or through Japan, Guam and Japan. That's part of the reason why what we're discussing is happening, why these countries that are caught in this are working together more. But do you think that's a head fake, or is that a real viable warfighting plan for the PLA in a scenario around Taiwan or the first island chain? Do you see a scenario where they're fighting as far away as the Pacific Ocean and the Tasman Sea, or is it a head fake to sort of intimidate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we ought to be looking at and planning for. The way that I've observed China's buildup of its power projection capabilities, it has been a very methodical and thoughtful and patient process. And you can look back to, say, China's anti-piracy patrols in the Indian Ocean in the Gulf of Aden that began in December of 2008. And, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, if you think about some of the commentary at the time about how, the Chinese won't be able to sustain it, they've never done any expeditionary operations and, they had to bring in pallets of water for their initial sorties and so forth. And yet, up to today, they have basically continuously rotated naval task forces on a virtually uninterrupted basis. They're on their 48th naval task force mission. And so, few would dispute that China now is in fact a permanent Indian Ocean power, and that through those various expeditions, they've been able to harness a lot of the skills, the software, if you will, the seamanship and so forth, the tactical capabilities, and to bring those back and integrate them back into the fleet. And if you think about things like the dual carrier operations that the Chinese Navy pulled off in June of 2025, those were taking place basically out to the second island chain. And according to Japanese reporting, they had apparently logged over 1,000 traps and launches of aircraft, which is pretty remarkable. And I like to remind people that, China had commissioned its first Soviet-era carrier back in 2012. So in the span of 13 years, we're seeing this pretty remarkable leap in capability. So while it might not be fair for us to compare the Chinese carrier operations with our carrier operations, I think we need to sort of trace that strategic trend line on China's own terms. And if you look at that, that's pretty impressive. And so I think going forward, in my view, is that this is not a head fake, but it's really a potential challenge going forward, which is that China could potentially pose a multi-theater or a multi-sub-theater threat, both in peacetime and in wartime. And so for Japan, as I mentioned, China can now operate in the Sea of Japan and in the Northwest Pacific and in the East China Sea virtually simultaneously, surrounding Japan essentially on all sides in peacetime. And for the U.S., I think over the long term, it's possible that China could open up a new front in the Indian Ocean with their expeditionary task forces in order to dilute our attention in wartime. So, it's true that, this isn't an area of competitive advantage for the Chinese in terms of blue water operations, but it's also true that we've not had to think about a multi-theater wartime campaign against a peer adversary for decades. And so, there's a real question as to whether we would be able to deal with a secondary front while we're having to cope with a major conflict in the central front over Taiwan. Again, we have, limited resources. We're stretched thin already as it is. And so to the extent that China can pose, multiple problems in multiple theaters, I think that's a possibility that we ought to consider, not about whether China will win a naval war in the Indian Ocean, but more about the kinds of opportunity costs that China can pose to us. And I think, one of the historical analogies might be, for example, the Imperial Japanese Navy's raids into the Indian Ocean. Had Japan pushed further, there's some interesting historical counterfactuals about how disruptive those raids might be. And so, again, I think we need to keep an open mind about the possibility of China doing something similar.
I've actually lectured at the PLA Command and Staff College back in happier days in U.S.-China relations, and I have no doubt they're studying those campaigns from 1942 in the Battle of the Coral Sea. And if Japan had won the Battle of the Coral Sea, the 1st Marine Division wouldn't have gone to New Zealand and Australia. And we had something like 1 million troops in Australia and New Zealand by 1943. And if we had not owned the air and sea corridors, it wouldn't have happened. At a minimum, the ability to project force and in the Indian Ocean constant force pulls Australia, pulls others away from the central front, which is the middle of this first island chain and the Taiwan Straits and East China Sea. That first Chinese carrier was the Liaoning, right? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
So when my son asked, I don't remember how old he was, 8 or whatever, he said for Christmas he wanted a toy aircraft carrier. So my wife went on Amazon, just ordered the first aircraft carrier she saw, toy aircraft carrier, and he got it for Christmas. He opened it up and it was a Liaoning, and it was made in China. Inside the box was a map of the 9-dash line in English, declaring that this was Chinese, the Nansha military district, and the Liaoning will defend it. So the good news is he's now off to university and he wants to go into the U.S. Navy. So,
oh, good for him. That's great.
And if he does it, maybe someday he'll be reading your books at the Naval War College. Last geography question. As American strategists have struggled or focused on the first island chain, and by the way, American strategists tend to focus on the first island chain when there is a peer competitor emerging from continental Asia. And the last time that happened was the Soviets. And 1948, George Kennan and his staff traveled to Tokyo, Manila, and he wrote back to the State Department saying, we have to defend the first island chain, and that's what we're going to focus on. And Korea was not in it. And then you had the famous Atchison Line in January 1950, right, where we drew the map, put up the map of the National Press Club with a line of how we would stop the newly constituted Chinese communist state. And Korea was on the wrong side of the line. So when I saw the first island chain statement in the national security strategy, I had, this all happened before I was born, but I had a flashback. What do you do about Korea in everything we're describing? It's a critical ally. It's a much more important technological, economic, diplomatic powerhouse than it was in 1948. But what do we do? It's sort of on the wrong side of all this.
Yeah, so I should have clarified that, I do think that we ought to include South Korea as an element of the first island chain. It's clearly a peninsula. It's surrounded by sea on three sides. And so I think it ought to be considered to be very much integral to that architecture. But I think you do raise an important point, and I think this is an issue that the National Defense Strategy also identifies, which is this problem of simultaneity, right? Which is that, would it be possible that the United States, focusing on a Taiwan scenario, might create an opportunity for opportunistic aggression by North Korea against South Korea? And would we be able to manage essentially two major regional wars taking place at the same time? So I think one of the ways that at least the NDS is describing this is that we would want South Korea to take primary responsibility for the singular defense in the northern direction, while the United States might be able to pull off some of those capabilities on the peninsula in a scenario over Taiwan. I think that remains to be worked out, but at least that's sort of the logic of how this administration plans on, dealing with the problem of simultaneity.
I like the way you put that. I agree. Korea should be considered part of the first island chain. If you look at the map and you kind of draw a line through Tokto, Takeshima, the Ancourt, whatever you want to call the islands, it's connected. And the sea lanes are critical. But as you know, in Seoul, there are debates about this. But the debates, as in the Philippines, as in Australia and Japan, are trending towards looking at this as a problem for all the allies collectively. And there's no alibi for anyone, even if the North Korea problem, requires so much attention.
Yeah. If I could add one more thing, which is that the defense of the Korean peninsula and Japan's security is also indivisible, right? So if there were a contingency to take place on the Korean peninsula, a lot of the forces reinforcements would flow through Japan as well. And so Japan also faces a simultaneity problem, which is that it obviously needs to defend the southern flank as it relates to the Taiwan contingency, but it's also very much tied into what might happen if a second Korean War were to break out. And so thinking about how you manage that problem from a U.S. perspective, but also from the perspective of our allies who also face similar problems would be an important thing going forward.
Toshi, whoever taught you Map of the Modern World when you were a freshman at Georgetown more than earned their pay. Thanks for bringing geography back. And people can follow Dr. Yoshihara's work at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and I think we'll get you back. I feel like we barely scratched the surface, but a good start. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.